Okay, we do appear to be live,
Yes,
I think.
both of us.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. As always, I'm your host, Kevin Mears, paranormal investigator and the Paranormal Encyclopedia. I am joined by my co-host.
As sometimes I am Brian McKinley, godfather of paranormal thrillers.
Okay, yeah, so far so good. We are live. Everybody just bear with me a moment. I'm going to post the link real quick on Facebook, and then we're going to get going. If you haven't figured it out from the title, tonight we're going to be talking about fairies. Brian, jangle some keys or something. It is why we keep you around, isn't it? Okay,
Gotta find a way
one.
to automate this part.
Okay, one more post and we're good to go.
Okay. And fairies.
Yep. Fairies, pixies, and similar winged elfin creatures.
Hmm. And vampiric creatures.
Also true.
That's that's the part I enjoy, the early fairy stories before they became cuddly and mischievous.
Just about every set of stories is more interesting in the original sources than when they get all cute and Disney-fied.
Hmm.
Um, it's always an interesting question because when I was talking at Telltale, people asked about this, and I've been asked before, and it's like, how do you reconcile fairies with Christianity? And that's a question that Christians have been asking themselves for at least 1,000 or so years.
Hmm.
Because they got to Ireland, and Ireland had all these stories of fairies and leprechauns and things of that nature. And Ireland is the most famous for it by far, but there are similar stories all over the place.
Yeah, especially in the British Isles, but also Germany,
Scandinavia with the elf.
Scandinavian places.
I mean, Scandinavia is where we have our elves and our dwarves.
Hmm.
Um, there are stories among the indigenous people of the United States of the little folk. Um, in Japan, there's this whole idea of the yokai, which are these mischievous sorts of spirits that a lot of times sound a lot more like fairies than anything else.
Yeah, yeah, I think most cultures have some kind of idea of something like that, similar to the way vampires and were creatures seem to be universal or near universal.
In my research of folklore, there's a couple of archetypes that you seem to find just about everywhere. Um, the the hungry dead, aka vampires, are certainly one of them. Whether they feed on blood or they feed on breath, or some weirder thing, you find very similar stories all over the world. Shapeshifters,
Mm,
you know, werewolves, bears, where almost everything you can think of. And I prefer shapeshifter because linguistically, I think it gets a little awkward when you're talking about a kitsune or a lot of Asian shapeshifters and some African ones as well, where it's an animal that takes the form of a person instead of the other way around.
yeah,
Um,
I think with like the Irish Selkie.
yep, ghosts are another one you find everywhere.
Yeah,
Um, there's the famous tribe that supposedly doesn't believe in God or gods, but they believe in spirits. Um, we need to do a more detailed episode about them down the road because people make a great deal of them being atheists, and it's like that's so oversimplified.
yeah, you
Um,
mentioned about them and yeah, they are very interesting.
we also don't really have that much information about them. Most of it comes from one. this one famous missionary who wound up deconverting from Christianity to atheism because of meeting them. So how reliable his accounts are is up for debate.
Hmm.
But to get back on point, fairies are very much one of these trickster spirits that don't neatly fit into another category, which varies because, as you're aware, many of our listeners are aware, because we've talked about it before, in some Irish folklore, fairies are just spirits of the dead.
Yeah,
Usually,
that's where the
spirits. I'm
people
sorry.
of
Go
the
ahead.
mount, the she.
I missed most of what you just said.
Oh, sorry. That's where the term she comes from for the sake of the audience, which is applied to a lot of the Fey beings in Ireland, and it refers to people of the mound, which is referring to the burial mounds, which are believed to be entrances to and from the land of the dead.
And they're very common in Ireland and Scandinavia, and
Yeah,
like
and often they
it
come
follows
seeking
along.
blood in those stories.
Um, so that's one of the ways that Christians would put the two ideas together. Is, well, okay, they were, people that were in Ireland before Christianity got there, because not for nothing, Christianity doesn't really exist until the first century and isn't really widespread until the second and third, um, and fourth really. But okay, there are these people who lived in Ireland and died in Ireland, but weren't really bad people maybe, but they weren't Christians because Christianity either didn't exist yet or hadn't gotten to the island. So they're not going to go to hell because they don't really deserve that. They can't go to heaven because they didn't believe. So you get this idea of fairies.
Hmm.
Um, Another story that's I find very interesting, at least, is there's this idea that Satan starts a war in heaven and gets kicked out, and about a third of the angels follow him. Then there's the angels that stay loyal to God that follow Michael. But there's an idea from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. There was a third group of angels that didn't want anything to do with the war. They wouldn't join Lucifer's rebellion, but they wouldn't fight on God's side either. Well, God isn't gonna, God doesn't allow this, so they get thrown out. But they don't get cast down into hell because they didn't rebel. They just didn't take sides. You get thrown onto Earth, and that's yet another version of where fairies come from. And if anyone's wondering and thinking, wait, this sounds like some modern idea, read Dante's Inferno. He talks about the undecided angels that didn't take part in the war being in limbo, his first level of hell. I'm not saying that any of these are true. I don't know. Um, I think there's definitely a fundamental tie between fairies and nature. Certainly, a lot of older spirits, like dryads, often get included with the fairies. Well, dryads are tied to trees, and nymphs are tied to sources of water, and it's and there's definitely a degree of overlap. And there's this idea that also became prominent in the later part of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance of elementals, of these spirits tied earth, air, fire, and water that were created before even the angels. And a lot of modern thought ties that varies to that.
Yeah, I've heard
Um,
of that, like ritual workings and stuff being used coming up a lot.
yeah, I will say elemental hauntings are some of the most. I've never experienced one, but from firsthand stories I've heard, they're some of the craziest things you'll ever see.
Hmm.
To the point that some of them have made the regular news. Is this weird thing is happening? We don't know why. Um, for example, if you have an earth elemental, you ever hear about houses that are rains of stone on this one house?
No, actually,
Particularly,
I've heard of that.
that can be an earth elemental.
Hmm.
Because particularly what you'll run into is okay. Stones falling out of the sky can be explained. Tornadoes and hurricanes kick stuff into the atmosphere, and eventually gravity has its say and it comes back down after possibly being blown even miles away.
Right.
Where it gets weird is you're sitting inside the house, it's being pelted by stones from above, and you can hear them hitting the roof. Then they start falling inside of the house. But when you go and look for the obvious, which is okay, where's the hole in the ceiling it came from? There isn't one.
Hmm.
They're just falling out from the roof of your ceiling of your house without putting a hole in anything.
Has
Um,
that actually been documented? That sounds pretty wild.
by paranormal investigators, yeah, it's not.
Hmm.
Charles Ford, I think, writes about it as well. There's another figure we really should do an episode on. Have you ever heard of Ford?
I don't think so.
Charles Ford was fascinated by the weird, might be the best way to put it. And he wrote entire books about houses being pelted by rocks, fish falling from the sky, ball lightning, and all these other things. What was interesting about Ford is he was very much just a researcher.
Hmm.
He went around, he talked to people who had these experiences, and he documented them. He wasn't saying it was real. He wasn't saying it was a hoax. He wasn't offering an explanation. He just thought weird things are going on. Somebody should be making records about it.
Hmm.
So there's now a whole subset of the paranormal. They probably would be offended by it, called Fortean, which is just dedicated to documenting weird things like this. Um, the other one that's crazy, and I haven't experienced this myself, but John Zaff is an extremely competent and talented investigator who's been doing this longer than I have and has forgotten more than I know about the paranormal. Told me stories about encountering this particular phenomenon where you're sitting in your living room and a rainstorm starts over your head. Houses that literally rain. Not a
Hmm.
plumbing problem, just water falling from the inside of the house. Now, what's interesting is if you're talking about like a mansion or another very large house, it's not common, but apparently very occasionally, if it's big enough and the temperature differences are just right, you can actually get weather inside.
Hmm.
But the accounts I've heard of this are, you know, middle class houses. They're not these huge houses where that should be happening. And lo and behold, water poltergeists or water elementals, also sometimes called undines. Um, Houses where tornadoes will start up inside of the house.
Hmm.
Everything just thrown around like crazy, incredible wind. Air poltergeists. And of course, one of the most famous and most debated and poorly understood phenomenon of all time: spontaneous human combustion. Um, and I've talked to a bunch of people about this over the years, but a lot of people will tell you, and it's true, that a lot of times there's a perfectly rational explanation for what happened. Um, Often,
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Smoking.
yeah,
Smoking.
smoking is a big one. You get somebody who's sitting on a couch for a long period of time, they light a cigarette, they fall asleep, the cigarette catches the couch on fire, and if the conditions are very precisely right, because it's a fairly finicky thing, the body will catch on fire and burn in such a way that the body and the couch may burn to ash, but the
Hmm.
rest of the house is undamaged.
Right.
It's called the wick phenomenon, if memory serves. The problem with this explanation is it's incredibly hard to actually reproduce. There is a documentary years ago that was done about spontaneous human combustion, where a guy used a pig carcass to try to reproduce it, set up all the conditions that were supposed to cause human, this thing to happen, and to get it to go up, he still had to use gasoline.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember Mythbusters did an episode on spontaneous human combustion as well, and they
Interesting.
staged it and tried to make it occur. I think also using a pig
Yeah,
because it's the closest analog.
it's a good analog to humans, but it's hard to reproduce. I mean, we have good documentation of it happening, and here's the other problem: is the Wick explanation takes hours.
Yeah.
Um, Even if it's true, hours it takes hours of everything burning. There are numerous firsthand witness accounts of people catching fire and going up in seconds.
Hmm.
That can't. That isn't the Wick phenomenon. That doesn't work.
No.
And again, there's no. It's been investigated. People did get the birds that caught fire often died. Sometimes did, just horribly burned. And there's the arson investigators don't know why. It's not common, but it happens. And I would argue that elementals might be a fire elemental. Obviously, might be an explanation. You want another weird one that I think scientists are finally accepting as a real thing because it was a debate for a very long time. Ball lightning,
Yeah.
which is utterly bizarre. I've never, it's very rare. I've never seen it, but I want to say my great grandmother not only saw it but was chased by it, which is one of the things about ball lightning is it tends to act like it has an intelligence. Lord Ruin asked, "Whatever happened to stop, drop, and roll?" Works pretty well, but not when you're doing an impression of the Human Torch in a matter of seconds.
Yeah, it's there. You can't drop fast enough.
But I think there's a good argument to be made that a lot of fairies are related to elementals, hence this long-winded discussion of them. Because again, fairies are usually tied to the more tied to the natural world. There's a lot, and I mean, most of the times when humans interact with them, it seems like the humans did something to annoy them or otherwise draw their attention. You know, some of what's his name, Rip Van Winkle, falling asleep up in the mountains in a fairy ring and wakes up 100 years later after
Hmm.
listening to the little men play ninepins. Um, Somebody builds a house on a fairy fort or fairy mound, and bad things start happening. I think one of my favorite examples that was here in the States, in Maryland, people buy a plot of land, build a, whatchamacallit, country club on top of it. They take out this one particular building. I'll come back to that, Lord, after I finish the account. But they have a bar on premises. Every night they clean up. They put chairs on tables and so forth, and they lock the doors and they leave. The next morning, everything's been moved around in a very specific pattern, in a certain so that it leaves a circle around the bar that a group could march around. And it happens night after night after night. They check all the keys are accounted for. That nobody has any idea how this has happened. Happening. Eventually, they get in touch with the priest. The priest gets them in touch with the folklorist, and at his suggestion, they build a beautiful garden with fountains and statues and things like that just across the way from the bar. And all of a sudden, all the weird stuff in the bar stops happening. My first co-host Drew pointed out, if you know the folklore very well, what you're talking about is called a processional, where fairies will come out at night and just march in circles for reasons we don't know. So the simple, even simpler, less expensive solution might have been just make room for them to march. And they'll do it, and they want to, and if they have the space, they won't mess with anything. Everybody wins, everyone's happy. No exorcists need to be involved. Lord Ruin made an excellent point, though. He said, I'm not worried about fairies because I have high will and fortitude saves.
Ah,
Yeah, that's
or
usually
cold
pretty good.
iron.
What?
I said, or cold iron. Handy.
I don't know if it's your volume or what, but you're coming out low and a little muddled.
Hmm. Maybe the microphone's just not picking me up that well.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Is it better now that I'm closer?
Yes, yes.
Okay, maybe it's just that I was leaning
Distance.
too far back.
Or maybe gremlins are messing with the system again.
Awesome. Electrical fairies.
Well, do you know the story of gremlins? I mean, where it comes from
The
originally?
the World War II,
Hmm.
where they blame them for mechanical malfunctions.
Not just that, pilots swore they could see men out on the wingtips of their planes.
Hmm. Like that famous
That famous bit from the Twilight Zone,
Yep, I
where
just
depending on which version you're talking about, either William Shatner or Jonathan Lithgow looks out the window and sees some monster on the wing of the plane.
yep.
That's classic Gremlin from the
You
World War
know
II.
they did a funny thing with that on Third Rock from the Sun.
I know.
Yeah, that classic episode where William Shatner and John Lithgow, the same thing happened to me.
Yeah.
It was terrific.
Lord Ruin comments that normal people wouldn't get his joke about fortitude saves, but on a serious note, isn't things like like a ring of salt supposed to protect you against fairies and stuff? Um, Salt is a common one. Iron, particularly cold iron, is of course the classic. They're not big fans of the sounds of church bells or prayer. Um, but yeah, salt. Particularly, although I would always advise if you're going to use salt for protection, use blessed salt, not just table salt or sea salt.
Mhm.
But a ring of salt is usually pretty good with fairies. I want to say like vampires. There's the stories of fairies having to count all the grains.
Could be there. There's a little overlap there. In
I'm
China,
gonna say
it's
more than a little.
well, yeah, in China and one of the Slavic vampires, they specifically have the counting thing, but but yeah, I think that also appears occasionally in some Irish and British Isles Fey legends.
Lord Ruin says church bells and prayers. Why? I mean, fairies aren't part of Christian mythology, so how does that even work? Actually, not Christian mythology as a whole, but particularly in the British Isles, fairies are very much part of British of Christian mythology. Um, there's a really good book I'd highly recommend people interested in exorcism check out called The Dark Sacrament, which is 10 stories of exorcism, five of which are from a Catholic priest, five of which are from an Anglican priest, all of which take place in Great Britain, Ireland, and those areas. And at least two of the cases are fairies.
Hmm.
I mean, they're very. In one case, yeah, the house is haunted because they built it on top of a fairy fort. There you go. Um, the other case, which is really fascinating to me, is they have a problem at night where they will hear a old woman wailing
Mhm.
outside. Sound familiar to anybody? Especially because it goes one step further, where they see an old woman at the riverside washing bloody white clothing. For those of you who do not know, the first should have been a big clue because it's the most famous way that the being is described. And we are talking about Ireland after all.
Yep.
And the second one is also a common association with the same entities. What I just described are two of the classic ways that banshees manifest, usually as an omen of someone's coming death. You're right, Lord Ruin, that because Lord Ruin asks, how does that even make sense? They're not mentioned in the Bible, so how do they integrate with Christian lore? Um, you probably weren't here at the beginning, but as I pointed out, Christians reconciled the idea of fairies with both either by claiming that they were the souls of people who died before Christianity came to Great Britain, or that they were a third group of angels that when Lucifer had his rebellion, one third goes with Lucy, one third stays with Mikey, one third says we don't want anything more to do with we won't take part in this war, and they get cast out on Earth, and that's another way that Christians reconciled fairies with their mythology. Um, there's also, I think, some of the reality of Christianity shows up and dominates a new area that had its own religion, and they hand wave and rationalize ways of explaining how things those people believed still fit within Christian continuity. Um, from a purely anthropological standpoint, there's this hypothesis that fairies were originally minor deities. A dryad isn't the goddess of trees; she's the goddess of a specific special tree. That's why she protects it and lives in it. You know, not you know nymphs and things like that protect specific bodies of water. And you have these minor deities that might have been worshipped locally, but Christianity comes along and goes, "What are we going to do with this?" and comes up with ideas like fairies. Lord Ruin asks, "Well, that's an additional question. Has the Pope ever made any mention of fairies? I mean, if Catholics are believing in fairies, wouldn't the Pope have something to say about that?" I'd have to look that up. I honestly don't know.
Hmm.
I mean, the church has always had a really complicated relationship with folklore, um, along with its, of course, tradition of just burning things at the stake, like people who were thought to be vampires or werewolves or witches. Um, in fact, there is a tragic truth there as well that goes into even the early 20th century. So one part of fairy folklore we haven't touched on yet that I was planning on is the idea that fairies kidnap people.
Hmm.
Now, people get kidnapped, fairies do strange stuff to them and usually return them. But one of the things that will sometimes happen is that fairies will interbreed with humans. They create what are called changelings.
Hmm.
While not common, there are known examples, even into the 20th century, of people being drowned because a loved one decided that they were a changeling. This is particularly common with children with various disorders. I'm loath to say it, given how many yourself and how many other friends I know have it, but it was probably not terribly uncommon for kids that showed signs of low functioning autism to be
Yeah.
labeled changelings and murdered.
Oh yeah, I think that makes makes a pretty good explanation of where autism was hiding in like pre discovery history.
Well, one of the first and yeah, Lord Ruin, you're absolutely right. It's parents trying to justify murder. But again, why are they committing the murder? Well, their kid was born autistic. Their kid was born with some deformity. Oh, they're not. It's not my child. It's a changeling. It's a fair. The fairies left it, and because that's horrible, that justifies me killing the child. I mean, in reality, it's they don't want a kid with whatever disability the kid was born with, so they killed the kid. But it's a way that folklore has been abused and misused over the centuries. What? I also find interesting is we have fairy lore going back hundreds of years. What what's become more popular recently, of course, is alien abductions.
Hmm.
And many of the things that are said about fairy abductions are also true of alien abductions. Aliens are also supposed to interbreed with people. People who are abducted by fairies and people who are abducted by aliens experience weird time dilation effects where they think they were gone for hours, but it was actually a matter of minutes, or they think something happened over the course of minutes and it was actually hours. In fairy folklore, this gets particularly extreme with stories like Rip Van Winkle, where he went down, laid down for a nap, and he woke up 100 years later. But there is definitely another similarity between these sets, and it's very popular for people who believe in UFOs to tell us that these fairy legends are just the way the ancient people who didn't know about aliens explained alien abduction. Um, Personally, I think that the vast majority of the time what's going on is purely psychological and has a non UFO slash non fairy explanation. Because a lot of it also sounds a great deal like sleep paralysis.
Hmm.
But I think there's probably at least a few cases that maybe something else is going on, and where the alien people want to always say fairies or aliens. My argument is the other way around. Is why are you so sure that physical creatures from another world are the rational explanation and not spirit beings? Particularly because another common trait of particularly encounters with aliens, not just the spaceships, is that they do lots of things that physical beings really shouldn't be able to do, like walk through walls, psycho, psychokinesis, moving objects with their mind, much of which persists in the area after the original experience. Um, and I just don't. I think either explanation works. And being me, and when you spend your entire life chasing spirits, you tend to see everything as a spirit. I will grant you, but I tend to think that the UFO cases that don't have a natural explanation, and many of them do, but I mean, even the government admits that some of it, yeah, we don't have an explanation for what the hell happened. Now, the scientists will admit we don't have an explanation for what the hell happened. And some of which is probably government's hiding. Government doesn't announce a lot of the top secret things it's doing for obvious reasons. And we know, as a matter of historical record, they've used the UFO story as a cover before.
Hmm.
During the 60s, when people were seeing UFOs, a lot of the times when, say, the SR-71 Blackbird or other highly experimental technology was seen that was top secret and no one was supposed to know about, was seen by civilians, the government would flip the story that was a UFO.
Hmm.
Because it kept the average public confused, and it kept the Russians, who had a big interest in UFOs and psychic phenomenon, chasing nonsense. The most
Yeah.
famous example of this may, in fact, have been Roswell, because the original story, the story kept changing. Originally, they didn't see bodies, and all of a sudden, they did. And it's been speculated that the popular story that got released is, of course, that was a weather balloon. It wasn't a weather balloon. It may have been a balloon, though.
Hmm.
Because again, it's a matter of public record now that things have been declassified to varying degrees that we were using balloon technology to spy on people. And the problem with using a balloon, whether or other spy, is sometimes they come down.
Yeah.
It crashes. The farmer sees a bunch of weird wreckage. It just fell out of the sky. Doesn't know what it is. Sheriff comes on the scene, who was originally the sheriff. The first one of the first law enforcement people on the scene was a retired Air Force officer, and now all of a sudden it's aliens. Was it aliens? I don't think it was. I think it was the government taking advantage of what was popular at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw a documentary where the whole Roswell thing like just was weird. The story did keep changing, and the aliens didn't even come into it until later. And
Yep.
yeah,
And there's even crazier theories that get into the aliens and things like that. Because another explanation I've seen offered is that the bodies that were found weren't aliens; they were humans that the government was experimenting on through Operation Paperclip and things of that nature. And as you said, particularly since the aliens don't come into the story, the dead bodies of aliens don't come into the story till later. I think the simpler explanation is it just got added on to the myth.
yeah,
Lord Ruin, there are men in black knocking on my door. I'll be right back.
yeah. But getting back to fairies, I was interested in hearing a little more about the Native American version, because isn't one of the sometimes ideas that's floated for the existence of Bigfoot being that he is actually some kind of extra dimensional or kind of
I,
being, and that's why he's
I
so
don't know
elusive.
a lot about the Native American stories of fairies,
Hmm.
but I can comment a little bit about the Bigfoot thing. Big Here's the thing about Bigfoot where it gets complicated. Yes, in Native American stories of Sasquatch or Uma, it's a mystical being with supernatural powers. It's usually takes on almost a boogeyman role, where
Hmm.
it's what it really does is it punishes naughty children. Be good or Bigfoot will get you, basically. Um, the thing about that though is in a lot of the native folklore that we're talking about in the tribes that we're talking about, most animals have supernatural powers.
Yeah,
Most animals are thought to be intelligent. So there is a fair question, I think, in is Bigfoot actually a supernatural being, or is he just described supernatural abilities by Native Americans because they see him as one more animal, and all animals have these kinds of traits.
hmm.
Um, there's also a theory about Bigfoot that I think can apply here, which is that he's actually what's called the tulpa, or
Yeah,
thoughtful. Because there's definitely a mystic spiritual component to some Bigfoot encounters. Not to mention the fact we have numerous accounts of people shooting at Bigfoot and things of that nature that should have left some sort, some blood, some sort of physical trace, but didn't. Or okay, we shot them. Where's the body?
Hmm.
So one explanation that's been offered is that they are actually a type of spirit, particularly this type that we call tulpa or thought form, where a person basically creates an entity with the power of their mind, or usually more often a group of people, um, which is particularly used as an explanation for why stories like Bigfoot are particularly common in areas, with Native American tribes that are known to have practiced shamanism and things like that, or in the Himalayan mountains where you have the what you call them,
Yeti.
the Zen Buddhists, who are the ones who that coined the term tulpa, for God's sakes, and that may actually be what's being described, and that's why no one ever finds a Bigfoot. No one ever finds more than maybe a couple of footprints. The much simpler explanation, of course, is that they don't exist at all.
Hmm.
But I don't think that's true. I think, and that's an excellent question, Lord Ruin. I'll come to it in a second when I finish the thought I'm making. But that I think there's enough accounts of Bigfoot that something's going on. That said, somebody sees a bear with bad case of mange walking around on its hind legs, because bears can do that. That might be what's going on. It's not, it is there is a natural explanation without invoking an animal we're not aware of. But I think there's too many accounts from clear-headed people. They're seeing something. They may just be wrong about what they're seeing. Lord Ruin also asked a really good question, which is, do you think that fairies can communicate through dreams? Do you think DMT entities are fairies? I recall people using DMT or something to try to communicate with DMT entities. Um, I am always very skeptical. And hey, Teresa Hall, glad you joined us. Of people who encounter spirits in dreams or while under the influence of hallucinogenic compounds. Because, I had a dream when I was a kid where I got chased around a friend of mine's house by Dracula. I don't think that was a supernatural experience in my dream. I think it was just a dream. Um, I have dreams about werewolves and all sorts of goofy, silly, weird nonsense. Then again, I think are probably naturally just the way the brain processes informations. Um, that said, I will absolutely grant that I do think that at times people do communicate with spiritual entities, which would probably include fairies. Fairies, I don't see why it wouldn't during sleep, during dream, um, as well as through DMT. In terms of DMT entities being fairies, um, to be honest, I've never heard the phrase DMT entity before, but get understanding what you're talking about, or at least I think I do, of people experiencing spirits while using hallucinogenic compounds. Um, I'm again skeptical, but I'm hesitant particularly hesitant to dismiss this idea or the dream idea because contacting spirit using altered state mental states to contact spirits is millennia old and a major part of a number of major religions in the world, or well, maybe not major, but significant religions in the world. I mean, Native Americans certainly peyote or mushrooms and certain things, and marijuana to try to communicate with spirits. Voodoo using rituals to try to summon their Loa, and things like that. I think it's possible. I think it happens. Um, it's hard to say for sure when it's real and when it's a hallucination brought on because you're using a weird chemical. Just because if you only see it in an altered brain state, how do you know it happened?
Hmm.
Granted, that said, altered brain states are so easy to come by. How do you know anything you experience is real? I mean, there's a chemical that humans carry in our pineal glands up here that's more powerful than LSD or peyote or magic mushroom, and it's a normal byproduct of the way the body, it's a hormone, it's the way the body, part of the way the body functions. But it's an incredible hallucinogen. You know, different brain, your brain can have for lack of a better way of putting it, a short circuit and cause you to hallucinate, even though you don't have mental problems. Um, we start the problem we run into is we start running into the question of solipsism, and how do we know what we think is real is real? Um, I don't like relying on what happens in dreams or hallucinations, just because it's weird enough trying to figure out what you really experienced in a normal brain state. Once you start adding chemicals to the mix, I don't. It's very questionable. I know that there are groups that would disagree with me on this. I do not recommend using hallucinogenic drugs while doing any kind of paranormal investigation. Um, it both, again, what anything you experience is now up to debate, even more than usual, and it may leave you more vulnerable.
Hmm.
What do you think about that idea about people contacting any type of spirit in dream or through hallucinogens?
Well, like I said, this one area is a little odd for me because it's the one thing that I may have actually had a direct experience with. I told you the story of like about 6 months or so after my father had passed away, seeing him in a dream where we literally just sat and talked, and I was completely aware that he was dead, in the dream. It was a very lucid dream. And, it wasn't anything crazy or anything. He sat there. He said he was sorry, to have left me and that he loved me. And that was more or less it. It was a very simple kind of thing, but,
I'm
like I
not
said,
re- yeah.
it had a profound effect on me. It left it left an impression. I was never completely convinced whether it was a dream or whether it was some kind of actual visitation.
See, the profound effect it had is what makes me biased towards it being an actual experience.
Hmm.
Like I said, I'm skeptical, but skeptical doesn't mean I don't think it happened. I just But there are so many accounts like what you just said. It's so incredibly common
Yeah.
that I'm not ready to dismiss it. Um, as explicable as it may seem,
Yeah. I mean, normally I'd be really skeptical of that kind of thing having any sort of deeper meaning. It's just, you know, it had to
it's
be
different
there.
when it happens to you.
Yeah.
Um, you're hardly the first skeptical person I've talked to who was like, I don't believe in this stuff, but there's this one thing.
Yeah.
I
That one time.
mean, I remember having a conversation with a guy who told me he was an atheist. He didn't believe in the paranormal in any sense of the word, and then told me about standing out on the street late at night one night and seeing a dude who was missing his head on the other side of the street. And it's like, okay, unless you're saying you're hallucinating, you explain that how? I mean, unless they're shooting a movie, that's a pretty impressive trick to be doing it in the middle of the night on a street corner.
Yeah.
And Lord Ruin says that he suggests looking up information on DMT entities. And fair enough. I'm curious. I'll do some research. Brian, that gives you homework too. We should both look into it.
Yeah. Maybe that could be a
Future
topic.
topic. Um, okay, we are coming up on 50 minutes. Unfortunately, I'm not feeling very well. I've been having some medical issues, so I think I might end things a little bit early. I do
Yeah. And
want to
I think we
apologize.
talked through most of it.
Yeah,
I don't have anything really more on fairies that I can think of. I'm not as knowledgeable on that.
yeah. Teresa Hall shares that she believes that people uh, do come to say goodbye. That her pawpaw came to her, and it was so important because she didn't get to see him. He called me not for the last time. That's really sweet. And yeah, I'm not dismissing your experience. I I'm not, there's too this is too widespread for me to just dismiss. Um, my own experience with a loved one passing away was and something a paranormal happening was quite different. And actually, I think I'll share that before we close out. So I was lucky enough in my life, and I've known many people who weren't, to not only know both of my grandmother and grandmother from both sides of my family, but to know them for a long time. They only passed relatively recently. I mean, it's been more than 10 years. I don't remember. I'd have to look it up. But it's been it hasn't been that long. I mean, sadly, all four of them outlived Lou. But I went to see my father's father in the hospital a couple of times before he died. And the very last time I saw him alive, my dad was out dealing with medical stuff for grandpa. My siblings decided to leave the room for a few minutes to give me time alone with Grandpa, being the oldest, having lived with him for a while when he was suffering dementia. And I'm standing there in the hospital room and seeing this figure. I mean, it's not staying still for long, it keeps moving around. But it's this shadowy figure that be. I would not agree with the label in this instance, but people might call it a shadow person. Dear God, that's another thing we should. I want to rant about sometime. But the thing is, I've encountered shadow people before, and it's never a pleasant experience, at least for me. This wasn't unpleasant. This was almost a sense of familiarity. And I looked at it and I processed what I was experiencing. And I said to the entity, "You're an angel of death, aren't you?" My sister, my brother, and I had all gone in my sister's car. So we get back in the car, go back to her place, so then I can get my car and go home. We get back to her place, about an hour away. I get back in the car. I live about 20 minutes from my sister at the time. I get the call that Grandpa has passed before I get home. I believe that was an angel of death come to take Grandpa home. Grandpa was not a perfect. I mean, Grandpa was a human being, so not perfect. But he was a very good man and a very devout man. He fought for this country during World War II. Well, yeah, I believe it was the angel coming to take him.
Hmm.
Which ties into next week's topic, actually, which I thought I'd announce before we finish. Which is next week we're going to be talking about archangels. Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, also known as Ariel. So yes, there's the Little Mermaid angel. I'm sure he loves being called that, and Raphael. But the
Hmm.
thing is, and this is kind of why I want to get into this. In most Christian and Jewish religious traditions, there are seven archangels, or possibly eight when you include Lucifer, who did his nosedive. So I want to try to get into a little talking about Michael and Raphael, Uriel, Gabriel. I want to try and get a little into the other ones, which is tricky because sources don't agree on the names of the other ones, or not all of them even agree that there's seven of them. But that's what's to look forward. This unfortunately will not be next week. Next week I'm going to be out of town.
I was just going to remind you of that.
So 2 weeks we're going to be talking angels. Other than that, I think that's going to wrap it up for
Next week
tonight.
will just be an hour of me jingling keys
There you go. I can give you
on
the logins
YouTube.
for Zoom, and you can go jangle keys for an hour if you want,
Yeah, that'd be funny.
or do
No,
anything. I mean,
it'd be
I
terrible.
trust you to do the show. If you want to do the show yourself, sometime when I can't do it, just ask.
Oh God,
I
no.
I
I
didn't
can't,
think so.
I can't sit and riff for an hour like you can. I just don't have that. I'd sit there silently trying to think of things to say for like a long period of time.
Well, you could do your vampire presentation or something if you wanted.
Mm, we just did, we just did the vampire thing.
I
We
know.
talked,
I
I
just
kind of
making a
talked about all
suggestion.
my vampire stuff, or most of it.
But I think that's going to do it for tonight, folks. This is Kevin Mears, the Paranormal Encyclopedia, saying good night and God bless. And
Right, McKinley saying keep your fangs sharp.
good night, everybody. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Teresa Hall, by the way, Brian says, come on, Brian. Desire is there. We'll see if we can get him to go solo sometime. But that'll do it for now.